Welcome to the intake air temperature shootout. We're going to test some different intake options for the Giulia 2.0 liter. We're going to actually data log the intake air temperatures at the intercooler itself, as well as pre-intercooler for each of these. We're going to test out what happens when you idle the car for an extended period of time with a closed box versus an open air hot air intake that's on the car. We're going to test and see what happens when you put the closed box back on and throw in the stock paper filter. And we're going to see what happens when you throw in a couple of high flow performance filters as well. We're going to see how that affects the 40 to 100 mile per hour times, because remember, we don't want to take any type of launches into account here. And we're going to see how our intake temps get affected by all of this. What we're going to do is we're going to do a 5-minute idle test after we've already stabilized the intake temps. We're going to do a 60 mile per hour cruise test, and we're going to do that performance testing with our dragy to find out if there's a performance increase in any of them. Now, I know there's always a lot of discussion about intakes. What's the best? Should I stick with the stock box because the paper filter does indeed, of course, filter better? Or do I need a cone intake? Why do people use cone intakes? Well, they use them when the stock airbox volume is a restriction. So if the airbox volume itself is a restriction, it doesn't matter what you put in the airbox, you got to get rid of it if the airbox volume is a restriction. Sometimes that's the case. In many applications, the airbox is not a restriction at all. So then also people choose to use when the airbox is not a restriction and they feel that the filter itself is more of the restriction, then they might just go with a high flow panel filter that goes in there. So let's just see which does what. So does running an open air intake cause a loss in power because air intake temps go up? Does the stock OEM filter in the stock box cause a loss of power because this paper filter is more restrictive? We know it filters better, so it might be a bit more restrictive. So do these panel filters help? Do they allow you to keep the best of both worlds? The stock airbox heat shielding with a higher flow panel filter, which of course you're going to get more contaminants in the engine with these, but this is why we choose intakes, is it's a trade-off. Maybe the additional flow is worth it. Let's see if that's the case. Okay, we're going to get the car hot, and then we are going to go ahead and do a cruise, and then we're going to do the 5-minute idle test on the Berger Motorsport open air intake. So we're going to do the 5-minute idle test. Okay, we had the pre-intercooler boost manifold intake temps up to about 140C. Then we pulled over and we had our intake temps at the intake manifold that's post-intercooler down at right around, I don't know, 53C or so, and we have started the 5-minute idle. So let's see what happens idling with an open air intake underneath the hood. Okay, we did the 5-minute idle, or I should say we're doing the 5-minute idle here, and we are at 5 minutes, and we reached 59 degrees Celsius here. For our post-intercooler intake temps, we're at 71 Celsius for the pre-intercooler intake temps on the open element Berger Motorsport intake. Now, we're going to go do some cruising at 60 miles per hour, and we're going to do our 40 to 100 mile per hour testing on the open air intake. And let's see what happens with those intake temps and the performance. Okay, we did our 60 mile cruise, and we did 53 Celsius for the post-intercooler temps, and we're at 64 Celsius for the pre-intercooler. That was after our 60 mile per hour cruise. That was about a mile and a half, and we'll do the same one for each on the this is on the Berger Motorsport open air intake. We're going to do a U-turn to do our performance testing. Okay, we're 5 minutes later here, and we've got the stock box in with the stock filter, so we're going to do some testing now. Okay, we started this 5-minute idle here at 54 degrees Celsius. It jumped up to 57 as soon as we stopped, but we're going to give it the 5 minutes now and see what happens. All right, 5-minute idle on the stock airbox with the stock intake filter. Okay, we're back doing the 5-minute idle on the stock air intake box with the stock filter in it, and we are at 4 minutes 54 seconds, and we're at about 61 Celsius for the post-intercooler intake temps. That's the important part. Those are the intake temps at the intake manifold that are going in the engine. And we're at 69 Celsius for the at the boost manifold. That's pre-intercooler. Yep. Okay. Okay, we've done the 1.5 mile, 60 mile per hour cruise with the stock box now in the stock filter, and we got down to 53 Celsius ish, 54 Celsius, 53 Celsius with the post-intercooler intake temps, with the pre-intercooler intake temps at around that 65 degrees Celsius mark. And let's see what happens after an extended idle. Okay, now we're going to do a little performance testing with the BMC air filter in place, 4-layer cotton gauze, oiled of course, versus the stock paper filter. So see if that makes any difference in performance. We know it shouldn't make much of a difference in intake temps versus the stock box with the paper filter, because we're still utilizing the exact same heat shielding stock box. Let's see if it makes a performance difference though. I'm going to do round 2 with the BMS open air intake for idling. So we're going to do the idling now, and we're going to do 5 minutes. This is after the car was heat soaked and after all the runs. So this is the second run, just to make sure that the order that we did the testing didn't make the big difference. So we're going to give it 5 minutes and come back. Okay, we did the 5-minute idle now with the BMS open intake that was done the last round. So we did it first round testing, and now we're doing it last round testing. We're still at 61C and 5 minutes. We're still at 61C intake temps. That's at the intercooler, 70C at the boost manifold, that's pre-intercooler. And the temperature outside today has gone up. We were at 96 degrees Fahrenheit with the earlier testing. It's gone up to 98, but it shouldn't have a gigantic impact, but just want to point that out for reference sake. So let's do some last performance testing on the last run with the BMS intake. All right, now we're going to get down to the fun part. Let's crunch the data and see how everybody did as far as intake temperatures are concerned and as far as performance is concerned. So what I did to try and help make this data a little bit more palatable is to make sure I bolded the important data, which is post-intercooler temperatures. So this is the air intake temperature after the intercooler. The reason this is important is this is the air intake that's actually going into the combustion chamber. And so this is the air intake temperature that all of your timing and boost tables are going to care about. That's what the ECU cares about. It does not care about what happened before the intercooler unless it causes an issue. So, you know, unless your intercooler is broken or something like that. But nonetheless, we're looking at post-intercooler temperatures. We did round 1 with the open air intake that was under the hood. Then we switched over to the stock intake with a stock filter. And then we switched over to the stock intake box with the BMC filter, which is like a K&N filter, the 4-layer cotton gauze. And then finally we went back and we retested the BMS intake, that open air intake under there. The reason I did that last again and went back to that original open air intake that we had started out with testing is I just like to make sure when I'm doing these sessions and doing this testing that the order in which we tested did not, you know, massively confound the results. And it shouldn't. We attempt to control for that by making sure, you know, that we start off with equal intake temps and, you know, flow the air over the car same amount of time, this and that. But it's always good to double check on these things. So let's just start crunching the data. We did the 5-minute idling. Here's where we started. And then the 5-minute idling after the 5 minutes. We did the 1.5 mile, 60 mile per hour cruise. We did the 0 to 100 data logging of temperatures from 0 mile per hour to 100 mile per hour. And then we did the 40 to 100 mile per hour times. So that way we can actually, you know, make sure we take anything, you know, out of these results that would confound them, like at the launch or, you know, spinning the tires or something like that. So anyway, let's start crunching it. So let's start off with the BMS intake round number 1. We started out idling at 55 degrees Celsius, and we ended that 5-minute idle, here's the important part, at 59 degrees Celsius. So during that 5 minutes that the car sat there just idling out in the 96-degree heat, we went up 4 degrees Celsius in intake air temperatures, okay? And just to talk about that, this is Florida. We were at 96 degrees today, and we ended the testing. Round 2 of the open air intake ended at 98 degrees Fahrenheit out there. So this was a great day to be testing these intakes, okay? So let's see what happened with the stock air intake box on the same idling. Started out idling at 57 degrees and ended the 5-minute idle at 61 degrees Celsius, okay? So the same thing happened. We went up about 4 degrees Celsius, okay? And finally, with the second round of the BMS intake, we started out at 60. We only went up to 61 degrees. We only went up 1 degree Celsius. I suspect that result is because the intercooler is, even though it's you know, its worst efficiencies when the car's just sitting there idling, it was doing something to try and keep those intakes at similar temperatures. So technically the winner here is the open intake. But these results are almost identical, so I really don't think we should call a winner. What we could say is that an open filter sitting in your car idling for 5 minutes had no negative impact whatsoever on the intake temperatures that are actually going into the engine. So that's a good thing. Now for the 1.5 mile cruise here that was at 60 miles per hour, the open air intake ended up at 53 degrees Celsius. The stock air box with the stock filter ended up at 53 degrees Celsius. And in warmer conditions, in 98 degree Fahrenheit conditions, the round 2 of the BMS, the open air intake there, was at 54 degrees Celsius. So again, I think we call this one a draw. All of the intakes as far as intake air temperatures did very well. Cruising and idling. How did they do 0 to 100 miles per hour? Well, let's go back up here to the BMS intake, round 1. We started our 0 mile per hour at 54 degrees, and at 100 miles per hour, it dropped down to 50 degrees Celsius there. So this car has a great intercooler setup. So as the car and as the boost and as the temps are heating up in the car going up to 100 miles per hour, the intake temperatures, the actual air that's going in the engine, is getting cooler with speed. That is the sign. Honestly, I don't see that very often on any, obviously not a naturally aspirated vehicle, but this intercooler system is functioning very well in these temperatures. And all of these temperatures would be significantly lower if we were in anything less than, you know, a torturous day. Like I said, this weather's terrible. Now let's go look at the stock intake box with the stock filter, that same 0 to 100. We did start off just a few degrees warmer. We weren't able to get them, you know, exactly the same. And it did end up just a few degrees warmer as well. So it went from 57 degrees Celsius at 0 miles per hour to 55 degrees, down 2 degrees Celsius to 55 degrees Celsius at 100 miles per hour. So here, the open air intake did perform a little bit better. It dropped 4 degrees Celsius. The stock box dropped 3 degrees Celsius. I think we can probably call that a draw, though. And now the stock box with the BMC filter, so that's the panel filter, like a K&N filter. This run started out at 60 degrees Celsius, dropped down to 58 degrees Celsius, dropped down to only 2 degrees. So a little bit worse results there with the stock intake box and the BMC filter. And then finally, the last run of the BMS intake, that's the open air intake, started that run at 58 degrees Celsius here, ended it at 55, so it dropped 3 degrees. And what we're going to see is our 40 to 100 mile per hour time seem to pretty much confirm all this. So our 40 to 100 mile per hour time, starting with the BMS intake, that open air intake, we got the best time of the day at 10.20 seconds. Stock box, stock filter at 10.65 seconds for that 40 to 100 miles per hour. And then the stock intake with the BMC panel filter, again like that K&N panel filter, was the worst of the day at 10.86 seconds. That was the slowest time. And then we did round 2 with the car hot, a little bit worse conditions, and that actually did a little bit better than the panel filter, as at 10.76 seconds. But it all also does seem to correspond pretty darn well with how the intake temps were functioning over those runs. And if we want to take a quick look at those runs, we can here. For example, here's the Giulia with that BMS intake at 10.20. You can see the slope that was slightly uphill at 0.18%. Pretty darn, I mean, that's about as good as you're going to get as far as flatness, though. So I say uphill, but that's about as flat as you're going to get. That was 10.20. And we look here at the Giulia stock airbox with stock filter, 10.65. Again, very slightly uphill there at 0.20. We see those temps. You know, it says 92 degrees. I can assure you it was 96. And that density altitude there, that was a hot Florida day. And here we have the stock box with the BMC filter. And this was, again, very slightly uphill, 0.08, about as flat as you can get, and same temperature up there, same density altitude for all these runs, and that was the worst performing at 10.86. And then finally, again, we already talked about this, the BMS intake, that's that open air intake last round, 10.76, went very slightly downhill there. Again, this is a pretty flat surface, so let's go back to those numbers. So what can we take from all this? Well, what we can say here is that the open air intake under the car, under the hood here, compared to the stock intake box, had no negative impact whatsoever. So it had no negative impact on the intake air temperatures, and it had no negative impact on the performance of the vehicle. I would probably say here that all of the intakes performed within the margin of error. We did not really see any significant outliers here when it comes to intake air temperatures themselves. They all performed well, so that's great if you prefer the stock intake box with the stock filter for you live in a dusty climate and you want to have that maximum filtering ability. I really don't think you're giving up much anything there. If you want to run open air intake because you like the noise, perhaps you think there might be a very slight, performance improvement, you're fine there too, because it is not causing any problems with intake air temperatures, and it did provide the best results of the day, but again, very slightly. So that open air intake may be responsible for 2 or 3 horsepower potentially, but if you were also interested in doing that to remove any restrictions that the stock airbox volume might be presenting, you could also drill holes on the bottom of the box, and you'd also be negating any types of those volume restriction issues. The panel filter in the stock air intake box did the worst of the day, but again, I think that's within the area of just general error here, so I would not necessarily say that that's a bad way to go. I think the final results here that we can say is that the stock, whether it be the stock box or the stock filter, putting in a panel filter or going with an open air intake, you're really not going to be making a huge sacrifice or a huge gain either way. All of these filters will work very well on the vehicle, and they will all work very well performance-wise. They will all work very well to manage intake temperatures. So, pick your poison based upon your own desire. I know there's a lot of myths out there with, your hot air intake sitting under the hood, it's going to cause you to lose, 15 or 25 horsepower or whatever. And what we see, this is the actual data that's data logged, is that That's not true. That's sometimes people do get those results, kind of weird, odd results on dynos. And what I can say is, if you're dyno testing an intake, you're wrong. You should not be dyno testing an intake. That's not how intakes work. They don't work on dyno cells with static airflow over them from whether it be a carpet fan or a nice fan that has a big motor attached to it. That's just not how intakes work. Real testing facilities for intakes have gigantic turbines that are bolted to the roofs that go down just these gigantic chambers that has a full frontal area in front of the vehicle, and they're able to simulate about 70 mile per hour winds over the front of a car, like a wind tunnel. Even the OEMs don't usually possess these. They rent them out. So a standard dyno room, even a dyno chamber that is temperature controlled, then these are $250,000. They just don't. You really have to go all out to get accurate results. In a dyno chamber for testing intakes, and really it's done with flow testing. And then it's done, on the road with acceleration and data logging, high-speed data logging, and that's what we've done today. And again, the results are pretty clear. That pick your poison.